More than 150 years ago, Abraham Lincoln abolished slavery. But the horrible secret is that today, in every corner of the United States, slavery, human trafficking, is rampant. We talk about gun trafficking, we talk about drug trafficking, but when we talk about trading in the lives of human beings, Americans believe that human trafficking, if it exists at all, exists in other countries and doesn't affect U.S. citizens. Well, today, we now know otherwise. We know that at least 100,000 citizens are enslaved in the United States. We know that thousands and thousands of men, women, and children are brought into the United States every year, forced into labor, forced into commercial sex for the enormous profit of their captors. 1/2 of the people brought into the United States are children. 3/4 of the people brought into the United States are legally here on guest worker visas that are obtained by their traffickers. This shocking epidemic is invisible to us because we do not know the facts. Why, for instance, is human trafficking the fastest growing, second most profitable crime other than drugs in the world? Well, it's because a slave will work for you forever until he dies or escapes, which is unlikely. And you can sell a little boy or a little girl for sex 15 times a day until they die. Life expectancy, 7 years. We estimate that between 21 and 36 million human beings are enslaved in this world. That is the equivalent of the population of Canada or Australia and New Zealand combined. We need to call human trafficking what it is. It is slavery. Men, women, and children controlled by their captor, and their captors can range from individuals, even family, to local gangs, to international organized crime rings. Human trafficking is slavery. Human trafficking is sex slavery. Prostitution, pornography, strippers, a $9.5 billion industry in the United States. Average age of forced entry into prostitution, between 12 and 14 years old. Did I say average? That means 9, 10, and 11. This is not consensual sex, my friend. No boy or girl 9 or 11 years old, consents to subject themselves to rape by a stranger 15 times a day. Let's talk about forced labor. Forced labor in the United States brings in a profit of $150 billion every year. That's people on farms in agriculture, in factories. That's people who are working in construction, as carnival workers, as domestic servants, in your nail salons, as your domestic servants. How does this happen? Well, these folks are recruited abroad, and they are recruited in our neighborhoods. And once recruited, it's very difficult to escape. They are recruited and then held by force, by fraud, by coercion, and by debt bondage. What do I mean? Well, let's take the 12-year-old girl who runs away from home because she's been raped repeatedly by her mother's boyfriend. 1/3 of the runaways in this country, in the United States, are contacted by an exploiter within 48 hours of hitting the ground. This 12-year-old leaves her home. She hops on a bus. She gets off the bus, and a very nice-looking gentleman says, "Oh, my goodness, honey, let me help you. Let me give you some food and shelter for the evening." And the relationship progresses a little bit, and he takes care of her and gives her that love and caring she's been craving, and turns her into his girlfriend and teaches her sex. And next he says, if you love me, have sex with my friends. And next he says, let's have sex with strangers because we need to pay the expenses. And then he puts her out onto the street with a nightly quota, and she says, I will not. And he says to his peers, you're going to gang rape this girl tonight. You could do anything you want to her. Just make sure she's alive in the morning. And when she comes to the morning, she is submissive. She is under his control, and she is also totally dependent on him or her for food and shelter. Local gangs, they do the same thing. They're very smart now. They understand that sex slavery is extremely profitable, and so they encourage the puppy love of a cute high school girl for a guy in the gang. Same seasoning process, one change. Some violence, absolutely, but they don't need that much violence because what's different? They know where she lives. So all they have to do is say, you're mine, I own you. And I know where your 4-year-old sister lives. Forced labor, that's the fraud. Advertisements, answered by the uninformed and the very desperate people for jobs, manufacturing, agriculture, nannies, models. The trafficker pays for the visa, and the trafficker pays the transportation expenses, and the victim arrives to find that they have been perilously deceived and forced into labor from which they cannot escape. Their documents are confiscated. And the debt bondage begins, a never-ending cycle of debt, first to pay back the transportation expenses, then for food and shelter, then for bad behavior or not making quota. And these folks think, because they're not familiar with our culture, that they can't leave, even if they could, cannot leave until the debt is paid, and that they're criminals for being there because they have no papers. I spoke to you about organized crime. Well, the international crime ring that brings in thousands of women from the Ukraine to clean our houses. They come in groups of 3 or 4. They do a great job. We rave about them. And they come with a minder to make sure that they do the work and to make sure that they're not stealing from us, but in fact that minder is there to make sure that they don't build a relationship with us because they are locked in a house after cleaning 8 houses a day, locked in a house together, and they are released after 3 years without pay. They're allowed to go home, but their silence is bought because, again, this ring got the visa. This criminal ring knows where they live, and so they just say, want your family to be safe? You won't be talking to anybody here or when you get home. Whew. So, these people need our help. They can't help themselves. I am passionate about being a lawyer, being a problem solver, being a trained advocate, to advocate for the elimination of slavery. I represent businesses as I advise them on how to be certain that the product they sell was not made by slave labor. I know we can save lives, but it will take each of us personally and every business, small and large, local, global, private, public, every business, every person, to decide to act in order to accomplish what we're going to talk about today, the elimination of slavery, to be a part of the solution. And the first thing that needs to happen is we have to create awareness. We have to save lives that are at risk 1 block from where I stand in Chicago today, within a mile of wherever you're sitting, anywhere in the world at this moment. We need to create that awareness because we need to make slavery visible. We need to magnify the reality of this horror. We need to drive it into the light and kill it like a vampire. And when we build awareness, we will fuel our determination to engage in the specific acts that will stop the sale of human beings in this world. Let me give you a few simple examples. What if every student, every teacher, every parent and every guardian, from middle school all the way up to super grad school, we're at registration required to take an age-appropriate interactive training program, and all it needs to teach is that this is what slavery is. It's in your neighborhood. And here's how to identify a victim, and here's the hotline number to call. What if every business did the same thing? In businesses today, we train for diversity. We train about sexual harassment. We can train every employee of every business, and that includes the global corporations, and they would be training their employees who are not in the United States. Same training. This is slavery. This is what it looks like. This is how to identify a victim. This is the hotline number to call. Oh my goodness, we're talking about millions of people becoming aware that slavery exists. Awareness? Yes. And there are more than just how to identify a victim signs. This is a picture of the likeness of a kind of young woman who has tattooed on her back a barcode. That barcode marks her as somebody's property. It not only psychologically impairs her as being under somebody's control, but there is actually a website which can trace this barcode. So how about some specific acts for addressing sex slavery? 1, raise the ante. A perpetrator who's been convicted of a crime? Well, let's go to the civil law, damage recovery, bankrupt him and take away the wealth that he and his family enjoy. Let's make the punishment fit the crime. You might be surprised that up until very recently, if a pimp got caught, they get that pimp slap, 1, 2, 3 years. Now New York is talking about, and Illinois as well, we're talking about putting a perpetrator of sex slavery in jail for 25 years. That may not even be enough because a kidnapper gets life. But at least let's make the incarceration so horrible, the fine so enormous, the public humiliation so great that we will raise the risk of somebody entering sex trafficking business. Let's change our vocabulary. We talk about pimps. But that's not who we're talking about, is it? We're talking about felons and murderers. We're talking about kidnappers and captors. Let's not even use the word pimp. And we never use the word victim, do we? We talk about juvenile delinquents and drug addicts. We speak about runaways, and we speak about prostitutes. We even use the word child prostitute, and there's no such thing. Any child engaged in a sex act is engaged in a rape situation. So we should be using the word victims. Change our vocabulary, change the law. The law should be directed against the perpetrators, not the victims. And by the way, if prostitution is illegal, and we know that it's a function of sex slavery, absolutely, well then, why aren't we arresting the buyers? Why aren't we fining the buyers more than a ticket? Buyers of sex, when we now know who's forced to engage in giving the sex, those tickets should be $1,000, $2,500, $5,000, $10,000 for offenses. Make demand decrease, make the risk increase. And by the way, when you're changing the law, do not legalize prostitution. In the Netherlands and Germany, where prostitution is legal, what happens? Demand increases. What happens? The traffickers understand that their profit could increase if they coerce more women and children into providing sex and becoming slaves. So legalization is proven not to be the solution. You think it's snack time. Let's talk about forced labor. The Department of Labor in the United States has a list of well over 100 products that are potentially produced by slaves. Those orange look good to you? They came from a slave farm in California, a slave farm in Spain, a slave farm in Florida. Tomatoes looking good to you? Slave farm, Florida. What tomato did you eat this afternoon and where did it come from? What tomato is in the cafeteria of your business? Coffee. What coffee is being served in the cafeteria of your business? Because where do coffee beans come from? Latin America, Africa, really good coffee, yes? Well, one of the largest purveyors of coffee in the United States that you would recognize has understood that there's a tremendous risk of slavery in the planting and harvesting and production and transportation of coffee beans, and so they have adopted a zero-tolerance policy for slave labor and bonded labor. And they have inspectors now that go to every farm. Expensive, difficult, yes, but guess what? As slave-free as possible. Good chocolate bar, huh? Hershey's, Nestle, Mars have figured out that their cacao beans, West Africa, no question about this, slavery. And they are now, to their credit, beginning to completely revamp their supply chains. Fancy Feast cat food, that's Nestle's. I won't ask how many of you have been using it. Maybe not for your own food, right? But you won't now. Fancy Feast cat food, Nestle's discovered, was made from fish from Thailand. Netted by little children who were literally stolen from their families, placed on the fishing boats, and forced to dive into the water to straighten out the nets. Only one problem, these little kids could not swim. So not only were they slaves for the life, but most of them died at some early point because they were drowning and correcting the fishing boats. Well, you can revamp your recruitment policies if you're a company. You can make sure that if you're recruiting people through third parties, that recruiter does not sell the job, but only receives compensation from the business. That recruiter, only gets money from the corporation. Visas and identification papers, totally accessible to the laborer. A risk assessment for slavery from every corporation. How likely is it that the product we sell has some form of slavery in the supply chain, and how do we know? A purchase order that simply has an extra clause in it that says, you warranty to me that the product I'm filling your purchase order with is not made by slaves, and that I will put that same clause in to my suppliers, all the way down to the fishing boat from original product. Simple. Slavery, an age-old problem, one that we can solve. Google human trafficking. It will tell you how to identify a victim and the hotline number to call. Call it, 888-3737, 888. Call it and be wrong. Call it and be right, and you have freed a human being. I want you to know, ladies and gentlemen, spread the facts, engage in these acts, get the extraordinary feeling of saving a life, because this, my friends, is war. And it is a war we must win. Thank you.